Thank you for joining us for this evening's program with Ian Rosenberg and Rebecca Aviel. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. In just a few weeks, we'll cross a significant milestone, 50 years of convening locally and thinking globally. Two items to be aware of before we get started. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for tonight's speakers. You can type those in there at any time. We'll get to them later in the program, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and the video will be available at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher have underwritten the summer season. The Hot Topics series is underwritten by Kathy and Neil Kimmel. And the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. We couldn't do it without you. Our next program will be on Monday, July 12th, and it will be our first in-person program since March of 2020. It will feature two career diplomats in conversation about diplomacy and foreign policy, Ambassador Christopher Hill and Ambassador Gary Grappo. Now we welcome Ian Rosenberg. Ian is an author, teacher, and assistant chief counsel at ABC News. His book, The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms, was released in February. Ian has more than 20 years experience as a media lawyer and has worked as legal counsel for ABC News since 2003. He graduated with distinction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and magna cum laude from the Cornell Law School. He began his legal career clerking for a United States District Court judge in the Eastern District of New York. He is also an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker, and he teaches media law at Brooklyn College. Professor Rebecca Aviel is the Associate Dean for Faculty Scholarship at the Sturm School of Law, University of Denver. Her areas of specialization include constitutional law, family and domestic relations, legal ethics, and legal profession. She clerked for Judge Barry Silverman of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She also spent 2 years as a staff attorney for the Ninth Circuit, specializing in civil rights, immigration, habeas corpus, and criminal appeals. Professor Aviel's research and teaching interests include family law, legal profession, and professional responsibility and constitutional law. She holds a BA in anthropology from Yale University and a law degree from Harvard Law School. I'm going to turn the program over to Professor Aviel now, and I will check back later in the program with audience questions. Again, for the audience members, please place your questions in the Q&A option down at the bottom of your screen.
Claire, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I want to start by congratulating Ian on publishing a book about free speech in what is perhaps one of the most chaotic, challenging, bewildering, and fascinating times to be talking about this issue. I loved reading the book. I'm excited to have a conversation with you about it. And I guess we'll start at the beginning. In the introduction, you share that part of the inspiration for this book arose from a conversation that you had with your kids in the aftermath of the mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. So I am also the parent of 2 children who believe passionately in their free speech rights. So this really resonated with me. And I thought our audience might be really interested to hear a little bit more about how you decided to write this book and your aspirations for how it fits into the larger body of work on the First Amendment.
Well, that's a great start. Thank you, Professor Aviel, and thank you, Claire and Chris, and most especially the Vail Symposium. It's really a pleasure to be here. So yes, I started writing this book, The Fight for Free Speech, in large part because even though I had been a media lawyer for over 20 years and had most of my career at ABC News has been dedicated to explaining complicated free speech and free press concepts to very smart people who aren't lawyers. So I thought that I was very much in the role of trying to synthesize and explain legal concepts without getting bogged down in legal terminology or precedent citations. But when I started having a conversation with my kids, who were at the time ages about 12 and 10, when they wanted to know, so if we walk out for National School Walkout Day, what does that mean for us? Can we be punished? What are our free speech rights? I realized in explaining to them, and of course my children are very brilliant, but I realized that by explaining to even very smart young kids that you can explain and condense the wisdom of our free speech law without dumbing it down. And that is very much what the goal of this book is. It is a user's guide, particularly for non-lawyers, to understanding 10 key Supreme Court cases that define our First Amendment, particularly our free press and our free speech freedoms today. And it does so by beginning each chapter with a contemporary question, like National School Walkout Day, or Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, or can Trump stop Stormy Daniels from appearing on 60 Minutes, and then explains these contemporary questions by telling the story of people who fought for their free speech rights all the way up to the Supreme Court, and what the court's decision tells us not only about their rights, but really about the meaning of America and our free speech rights today. So it is very much a storytelling book, and a book that is designed to hopefully give people what they need to know in a very concise and readable way.
The storytelling aspect of the book is, I think, one of its most valuable features. And it really, and I would say this on a number of levels. So first of all, one of the things that is so effective about your book is what you just mentioned, that it draws parallels between today's free speech controversies and their historical predecessors, right? So like Mary Beth Tinker and the students behind the March for Our Lives movement. And the stories that you tell about the personal circumstances of the figures behind our most iconic free speech cases are beautifully rendered. And
thank you.
They offer new insights, even for those of us who have long been familiar with the doctrinal aspects of these cases. So like one of my favorite examples was with the Go Bidas children. Right, they were expelled from school for refusing to pledge the allegiance to the flag because it was in conflict with their faith as Jehovah's Witnesses. That much we see from the opinion, right? Those of us who have read the judicial opinion. What I had never known was that they're homeschooled at first, right? Because that's the logical next step for them after being expelled. And then the superintendent threatens to send them to reform school because they're not being properly educated by a professional teacher. And so then the community comes together and finds a farm and sets up this makeshift school for them and the other Jehovah's Witnesses children who had refused to pledge. It's too far away from their homes for them to commute every day, so they have to stay there during the week, right? Again, as a parent, I'm really internalizing that hardship, that disruption of the family, right? And their living conditions are so crowded that they're sleeping 3-2 a bed. And, you know, so this really made an impact on me. And I'd invite you to expand a little bit on how this narrative and this storytelling that you do in each of these chapters contributes to the purpose and design of the book. Right? How does it help us better understand the First Amendment, to know these details about what those litigants were going through?
Well, I love nonfiction storytelling. As Claire mentioned, I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and I often in my documentary work, and I'm proud to say in supporting the work of one of the shows I work very closely with and have for the last 15 years is ABC News Nightline. And I've learned a lot from them about talking and tackling really complicated, cutting edge issues, that you're always looking for a story. You're always looking for character and story, and that then the facts come out through those characters. And I think it's a more effective way. It's certainly a more I think, exciting way. It's something that grabs us. And as Professor Aviel said, in law school, you never learn the backstory of these cases. So you learn just enough of the facts to be able to understand the analysis, but never, what was their bed like, or how muddy were the roads that prevented them from going home on weekends. And I think that besides, I like to tell a good story, and I think it would keep people engrossed, I think that what it shows us very often is that people, I think, sometimes think of free speech law as sort of titans battling each other. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's the New York Times and Martin Luther King. But most of the time, particularly in free speech cases, you have very, I hate to use the term average because these are very interesting and exceptional people, but they are average citizens. They are students. They are, people working in DC and PR. They are, really, a 20-year-old guy who's going in to testify about a traffic case, and he wears a jacket that says "F the draft" on the back, and then becomes a free speech advocate. So I want people to really think about free speech rights and the fight for free speech as something that not only has come about because of everyday people, but is something that is so important to us, not just lawyers, but as everyday Americans. This is really the story of true Americans. And I don't use the term heroes because not every person here is heroic, and sometimes they are somewhat reprehensible, but they are definitely free speech pioneers, and I think their stories are fascinating.
Yeah, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit more about the sector of free speech doctrine that is titans battling each other.
Yeah,
because,
sure.
I think that we'll want to explore that as well. But to follow up a little bit on this idea of ordinary citizens, right, living lives with concrete detail that might be interesting to us because we love storytelling, and that's part of the human condition. I guess I would ask you to reflect a little bit more on the extent to which these stories reveal the extent to which having some form of expressive autonomy is part of human flourishing, or the extent to which the characters in these stories viewed it as a portion of their identity that they were not willing to abandon.
Yes, well, I mean, let's talk about Mary Beth Tinker, who was I think, a perfect example of this. This is a middle school student in Iowa. She was about 12 or 13, and she believed during basically the beginning of America's involvement in the Vietnam conflict, back when the war was still avidly supported by a majority of Americans. She decided she wanted to wear a black armband to school to support and pay respect to the deaths of people on both sides, both American casualties and Vietnamese casualties, which was a very radical notion in its day. And even protesting the war was a very radical notion. And she is somebody who felt deeply about this, even though she was 12 or 13, and her brother felt the same, and one other friend. This was not something that they took lightly. And one of the things that Mary Beth has talked about in interviews is that you can have a little bit of courage and it can make a big difference. So she wears her armband to school. Nobody says anything. Some people tease her, but nobody says anything. It's not disruptive. And then Mr. Moberly, her favorite math teacher, says that she has to go to the principal's office, and the principal's, they pressure, one might say bully, her into taking off her armband. And she talks about how, what I did? I took it off. And she says, you only need a little bit of courage. Now, they suspended her anyway, and she ended up continuing her fight to the school board, and then having her case being taken up by the ACLU and fighting it all the way to the Supreme Court. So she took her little bit of courage. I think it was actually quite a bit. And it felt like it was a personal need for her to express this dissenting view. And my book is very often about people who want to dissent. And I believe that one of the most important values that comes out of the First Amendment is the ability to protect dissent. And most often we are talking about unpopular dissent. So sometimes dissent takes on sort of a rosy aura of inevitability. The civil rights movement today seems inevitable. But at the time, Dr. King and the March on Washington both were viewed unfavorably by a majority of Americans. And so dissent is rarely popular, but for those Americans who want to express themselves in a particular way, it is really vital to who they are as individuals as well as who they are as Americans. And I think that's what's so exciting about hearing these stories, is the way in which their need to express their free speech rights really was fundamental to who they were, as you were pointing out with the Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to pledge the flag, and what that means for Colin Kaepernick and other people who choose to take a knee today.
I really agree that the part of the First Amendment that's easiest to love is the part that we've been really celebrating, right? The struggles of heroic, or at least charismatic, right? But definitely deeply human. Individuals often from marginalized or persecuted communities, kind of battling the application of government power to stifle their expressive autonomy, right? And I agree with you absolutely that it's important to not take that neighborhood of the First Amendment for granted. We need to teach it to our children. We need to cherish it and celebrate it, and we need to understand it, or else it will get away from us. Yes. But there is another corner of the First Amendment. You might call it the Titans battling. Scholars have pointed out that maybe the better metaphor is not there's different neighborhoods or different sub areas, but really that the political economy of the First Amendment is changing, so that we are maybe moving away from a time in which the First Amendment was primarily about protecting individual dissent, right? And even a case like New York Times versus Sullivan, this libel case against a newspaper, as you illustrate so effectively in your book, is really a case where the real protagonists are the civil rights activists who take out the advertisement in the newspaper, right? But what a lot of us are worried about is that, there's a side of First Amendment doctrine where the successful challengers are of a really different ilk, right? All these cases, I'll just mention a couple, right? IMS versus Sorrell is one, right? Where you have the Supreme Court siding with pharmaceutical manufacturers against a law that prohibits pharmacies from selling information about doctor prescribing practices without the doctor's consent, right? Or perhaps most infamously, Citizens United, right? Where you have the Supreme Court invalidating on First Amendment grounds campaign finance reform, bipartisan campaign finance reform, I might add, right? And arguably, in a case like Citizens United, you actually have First Amendment values on both sides, right? So it isn't about the First Amendment versus other important things. It's about what does the First Amendment really mean and how do we operationalize that, right? So, those of us who are critical of Citizens United can certainly tell a story in which the government regulation that was struck down is about valuing the marketplace of ideas and about protecting the robust and uninhibited exchange of ideas, right? By kind of equalizing access, right? So in that case, of course, famously, the court said that it's not a sufficiently strong interest for the government to sustain a regulation on speech to try to, safeguard elections from the distorting effects of corporate wealth, right? We're skipping over a lot of complex doctrinal detail here, definitely for the better, but I guess, how would you respond to the basic critique that the First Amendment has changed its character, that it's become a deregulatory instrument that is, being wielded by powerful interests, that is being used to facilitate the further concentration of wealth, and that in the end undermines rather than reinforces representative democracy?
Well, that's a key question, and there's a lot to chew on there. Let's start with maybe taking a step back and saying that the reason I found these 10 cases particularly instructive is, and I organized them chronologically by Supreme Court case. So the contemporary issues sort of are all like ripped from the headlines of today, but we begin with the Marketplace of Ideas case from the 1920s with Abrams, and we go to all the way to the court's most recent and only discussion of social media case, a case called Packingham in 2007. So we go from the beginning of First Amendment law in the 1920s to almost contemporary today Supreme Court doctrine. And the reason I do that is because I think this idea, popularized in part by Justice Kagan's line that the First Amendment is being weaponized by conservatives, that idea is true, but I think that for those of us as Americans who don't know of the cases of the past, I think it sort of ends up weighing too much in people's view of who the First Amendment is designed to protect. And I would be a very poor free speech advocate if I didn't want to hear dissenting opinions and didn't want to hear the critique that you just so articulately presented. But I do think that it's important to take the big picture when we're looking at First Amendment law, and that so often, as you said earlier, that it is marginalized voices, it is dissenting voices, politically, racially, people who are against the war, people who are religious minorities, who are so often protected by the First Amendment. And I would argue that the First Amendment is the very, very rare issue before the court, or series of issues before the court, where traditional, let's say, conservative versus liberal interests break down in the most interesting ways. If there is ever going to be consensus on our current, much more conservative Supreme Court, it is on First Amendment issues. And as we were talking about before the program, the court's most recent and very significant discussion of student speech cases, a case called Mahonoi that we can talk about in a minute, but it just came down and it's an 8-1 decision with a mix of the conservatives on the court as well as all three liberals, really reaffirming the centrality of student speech and the importance of public schools as a laboratory for democracy. So I think it is important, but it is an oversimplification, not by you, but by the popular press, to say that that the First Amendment today is all about corporate interests, and that the First Amendment champions, Chief Justice Roberts describes himself as, sometimes he's called himself the most stalwart defender of the First Amendment. I don't know if I go that far, but I do think that he cares deeply about First Amendment values, as do other members of the conservative bloc on the court. And so I think I ultimately, just to sort of in one sentence answer your question, ultimately, I think that what has changed today, one of the reasons I try and use contemporary examples to compare to the cases of the past, is that although technology has changed so much today, although our political world continues to change so much, I still believe that the values of the Marketplace of Ideas from the 1920s still are very much the values that inform our First Amendment law and should continue to inform our First Amendment law, not only on the court, but also for individuals, at school board meetings or at City Hall when they're engaging in debate. So I think less has changed in terms of the interpretation of the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's interpretation of First Amendment law. Less has changed than one might think.
What do you feel is the biggest threat to free speech rights and this tentative consensus that you identify across the partisan divide on the court? Where should we be concerned about destabilizing these ideals that have informed First Amendment doctrine for so long?
Yes. Well, so let's just answer that for a minute by talking about the marketplace of ideas. So and what that means in a minute or two. You know, in the first case, I talk about how there are World War I anarchists, people on the Lower East Side where I normally live, who are throwing out anti-World War I leaflets, and they are convicted and sent to prison terms or sentenced to prison terms of 15 to 20 years for essentially just criticizing the government. And their conviction is upheld in a case called Abrams, but Justice Holmes, joined by his friend Justice Brandeis, dissent and introduced this concept that informs all of First Amendment law, the marketplace of ideas. And really says that the best test of truth is the power of itself. I'm paraphrasing here, but the power of truth to get accepted in the marketplace. And that idea informs all of our First Amendment law. And I think it has a lot to do about our democracy today and the problems that you were alluding to that we need to be concerned about. I also want to mention, though, that who is included in that marketplace is something that too often gets short shrift among First Amendment advocates. And I do point out in my book, and I want to point out here today, that so often the people who don't get their voices heard in the marketplace are Black people, they are women, they are the economically disadvantaged. And so we can't just celebrate that critique, that metaphor, without embracing the very valid critique of it as well. So what is the key problems that we have to worry about today? I think the key problems are the difficulties and the perils of social media, and particularly online speech. There are real problems with online speech today. Hate online, mob sort of efforts to drown out speech, false information, both about the election and that led to the insurrection at the Capitol, as well as about COVID knowledge and precautions and the validity of vaccines. So misinformation and hate, I think, are the greatest threats to free speech. But I would also then argue that I think that that most of the time we can either solve those problems with our current set of First Amendment values, or the First Amendment isn't the right tool for solving those problems, but that doesn't mean we should give up. So one of the things I want to do in this book is identify when the First Amendment does apply, and then when it often doesn't, even though people don't necessarily know that, most commonly when private individuals, when private companies are involved. So the First Amendment, if we're going to learn one thing today, people should know that the First Amendment really only applies when the government or government actors are involved, and that can include public schools, but that's basically it. So sometimes the First Amendment is at issue, and I think it's basically we should continue down the path we have. And then other times, with much of social media problems, we can talk more, is not at issue, but I don't think we should give up there. So in one phrase, social media and misinformation are the greatest threats to democracy and a robust First Amendment.
It's interesting. One of the things that you articulate really clearly in this response is that we have distortions and we have defects in our marketplace that we need to address, but we also need to be really clear about when the First Amendment is the right tool for that, or even the right frame of reference, right? Yeah. So there are a few different things we could point to recently that present both of those issues, right? One that's been on my mind is an opinion expressed by Justice Gorsuch just this past Friday, that First Amendment law in some ways is responsible for the amount of misinformation that we're seeing, right? So just to lay the groundwork for readers who might benefit, from audience members who might benefit from a little more background, Justice Gorsuch is essentially arguing that the actual malice standard that you describe in the book, right, the principle that was intended to provide ample space for public debate by making it really difficult to win a libel suit against a public figure, right? This was the bedrock principle of New York Times versus Sullivan. Justice Gorsuch is asking the court to revisit that. And his argument is that because nobody is afraid of libel liability, because the actual malice standard is so hard to meet, that there's no incentive anymore to make sure that what you're writing and publishing is accurate. In fact, the incentive is the contrary. Right? And he pairs that critique with an observation about how the media landscape has changed, right? He says, look, maybe in 1964, when we decided New York Times versus Sullivan, it made sense because we could trust that there were sort of a few venerated, respectable, responsible media outlets. They had investigative reporters, they had fact checkers, right? Maybe they made a couple mistakes around the margins, but we could rely on what they were producing. And because there were so few of them, we were worried about, crowding out dissenting voices or critical voices. His point of view is that now everything's changed, right? Most of the newspapers have failed. The networks are, facing declining viewerships. Everybody has a soapbox in their hand. Right? Everybody has immediate access to the world. They can say or publish anything that, almost literally anybody in the world with access to a smartphone can see. And he's saying that the First Amendment, as the court has interpreted it, has turned into an ironclad subsidy for falsehood. Right? So I know that's a lot, but as you yourself noted, experts are concerned about deception circulating faster than truth. To what extent are you willing to engage with this idea that the actual malice standard is contributing to the crisis of misinformation?
I'm not willing, I'm willing to engage in that debate, but I think it is entirely false. My father was a retired economics professor, and he talked about how Truman once said that he wanted a one-handed economist because he didn't want somebody to say on the one hand this, on the other hand that. So I'm going to be a one-handed First Amendment lawyer and say that that is entirely a misleading argument that you well summarized from Justice Gorsuch. And let me back up to explain why a little bit. So first of all, I go into, the contemporary issue about libel that I talk about is former President Trump saying that, when I said it as a candidate, when I get elected, the media can lie and get away with it, and I'm going to change those libel laws when I get elected. Now, beside the fact that I think only libel lawyers and First Amendment lawyers cared about this issue besides celebrity lawyers, but besides celebrities, he continued with this every time that somebody criticized him, particularly when there were books that were critical of him. And he, either intentionally or for lack of understanding, absolutely misrepresents what our current libel standard is, which, as you know, is that, and sort of skipping over the history and how it was designed to protect the New York Times from being bankrupted for publishing an ad supporting Dr. King and the civil rights movement. The standard that comes out of this is a balancing standard created by Justice Brennan with a unanimous court that says that you can criticize public officials and get away with it as long as you are not engaging in knowing falsehoods or reckless disregard for the truth. So that means lying. You cannot lie and be protected by our current libel standards, or sort of turning a blind eye to the truth. The truth is right there, but you're not going to make that one phone call or look at that one document. So that's our standard right now. So I find it, so Justice Gorsuch takes a real problem, misinformation and disinformation and false speech, in general, but particularly online, and then sort of without much explanation actually says, and that, as you well said, and that is being increased by our current libel protections today. And I think that is absolutely not true, because first of all, he bemoans the deterioration or the less popular state of mass media for groups that I work with, like ABC News or the New York Times, and then says that because we don't have organizations that engage in fact-checking like news organizations do, or that engage in rigorous review, and because that they are less popular, which I somewhat dispute, but because of that, we should remove the protections for those institutions, and once again allow those institutions to be sued even if they make a small mistake. And therefore, that would then destroy the remaining institutions that we have of the traditional mainstream press, both news and media. So I think it is a solution that actually would cause a greater acceleration of the very problem that he bemoans. And then also on the sort of specifics of in our media world today, everyone sort of has an ability to have a mouthpiece. That is true, but libel laws today can still engage in a very much of a truth-telling or truth-reinforcing function. I would bring up, though Justice Gorsuch wouldn't like it, I would bring up, I suspect, the cases against Fox News and other organizations by the voting companies. I always forget the names of the two major voting companies.
Dominion and
Dominion and Smartix or Smartmatics or something. The two major voting companies that many many news organizations just said seemingly extraordinarily false statements about how they were engaging in willful fraud and leading to false election results. When those companies sued the conservative news organizations, those news organizations issued retractions very quickly and are actually facing a very significant threat. And I think that element of the sort of sword element of libel law will actually continue to help protect the truth to some degree. But the final point I would make here is that Justice Brennan specifically did not provide blanket protection for the media. There were other justices on the court that said the media should just be always protected when they criticize a public official, no matter what. And Brennan wanted to create a fearing McCarthyism when he knew that in the past people lied with impunity and destroyed lives. Even though he was so press supportive, he did not want to give the press this cloak of inevitability or cloak of complete power. He said, let's create a balancing. So that, I mean, it's a little bit more than the balancing, but let's create a system in which you really are only penalized if you are engaged in lying or turning a blind eye. And the idea that organizations don't care about this today, I think is also proven false by the fact that I have a job. My whole job is to, if it was so easy to sue media companies, if it was so easy for media companies to defeat lawsuits, they wouldn't employ people like me to make sure that we are to have another check on accuracy and protection. So it's a very important question. Justice Gorsuch and now joining Justice Thomas are now 2 votes to overturning our current libel standards. And if you read my chapter, as you have, but if the audience reads my chapter on libel, I think they will get a better understanding. I know they will get a better understanding of the argument, and I think they will maybe agree with me that this is the wrong way to fix a real problem.
And I think we have time for me to ask you one more question before we turn it over to our audience. I, in closing, would ask you if you can offer a case or an area of free speech law where you think the court has not been sufficiently protective of free speech rights. Is there an area where they took a wrong turn and failed to promote the values underlying the First Amendment in the way that you celebrate so effectively in your book?
Thank you. Well, there are certainly, you mentioned some before, and there are certainly, cases I disagree with. And the goal of taking 10 cases, and I really, there's a lot of endnotes. So the book is about 200 pages without the endnotes. So if you want to delve into where I disagree with the doctrine, you read in the endnotes. Readers can read in the endnotes and sort of follow those paths. But But I would say that the area where I most disagreed with the trend of the court has been somewhat corrected. In this case, we are talking about in student speech. So we have this Tinker case, which I started talking about, but then didn't really finish. So Mary Beth Tinker wears this armband. Her case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in an amazing opinion, says that students don't give up their rights to free speech as they pass through the schoolhouse gates. And this was at the beginning of the middle of the civil rights movement, maybe the end of the civil rights movement, inspired by student advocates, inspired by anti-Vietnam War protesters. The court has this rousing defense of free speech for students, and basically says that there needs to be sort of a substantial disruption, that you have to have a real evidence of substantial disruption in order to restrict student speech rights. And that was the key case. But there were sort of three cases after that in which the court kept sort of carving back on student speech rights. They said that you could restrict student speech rights if people sort of engaged in lewd speech. There's a student who gave a nomination speech for student government and used lots of sort of rude and crude double entendres, and his speech was upheld. The administrators restricted it, and the court said that was okay. And then the court says, student newspapers can be restricted because it's not really student speech, it's really the government, it's really the school is the administrator, and so they're allowed to restrict their own speech. The school is the publisher, essentially. I disagreed with that decision. And then there's what's often known as the Bong hits for Jesus case. Morse, a student put up a nonsensical banner that said Bong hits for Jesus just to sort of create controversy. And the court said that, advocating for drug use could also be restricted by the court. And so there has not been a case upholding student speech rights since Tinker. Yet with this Mahoney case, which many people might know more effective or more quickly as the cursing cheerleader case, she said, I'm not going to curse here, but she said F cheerleading and F school and F everything. And she said it on Snapchat and it disappeared, but people saw it and objected, and she was kicked off the team. Even though she did it on the weekend, on a private cell phone, not on school grounds. And the court said that even although the school districts might have some rights to restrict off-campus speech, that they have to tread very carefully if they want to do so. And that in these circumstances in particular, where there was off-campus, no threat of violence, and during the weekend, that they could not restrict a student speech rights. So I think somewhat remarkably, I'm very surprised by the decision. People were very concerned when the court took the case that they were going to sort of put a death knell blow to Tinker. They have course corrected, I think, in a very successful way there. So I'll end on an optimistic note. I have lots of quibbles and more than quibbles in other areas, of course, but that is of the moment and very reassuring.
Excellent. Well, I also like to end on an optimistic note. So Claire, why don't you talk us through some of the questions that our audience members have?
Thank you so much. One of the questions that's coming up, and a few people have raised it from different angles, involves free speech on campuses. For instance, David has asked, can you talk about the Chicago principles and the rationale for those universities that don't support them? And then John asks, also along the same lines, he says he feels that the most significant threat to free speech is the suppression of conservative ideas on college campuses, where the First Amendment is applicable because these are state-run schools. Can you talk about what's going on campuses and what you see there? And I guess what I would add to that is whether or not this is something that's quantifiable or if it's more anecdotal.
Well, those are lots of good questions. I talk about public school, elementary school, and high school middle school and high school speech in my book. I don't talk about the campus speech issues. If you're looking for a book that discusses those issues in more detail, I recommend my old mentor and friend, Professor Donald Downs' book, Free Speech and Liberal Education from the Cato Institute. He's a brilliant First Amendment scholar. We don't agree politically often, but he is also very concerned about what he perceives as a restriction of conservative viewpoints on college campuses. There's also the organization FIRE that is really sort of like an ACLU to protect sort of college campus speech. And they do wonderful work. However, I will say that I think that often two things. One is that people think that freedom of speech means freedom from consequences. And that is not true. In fact, many of the people in my book who I talk about who win their First Amendment speech rights still face other serious consequences, either criminal or otherwise. They lose their jobs. And so if you, too often I think people, think that I don't like the term cancel culture, but, just as a shorthand, people think that there's a cancel culture if somebody objects to a conservative viewpoint. And I would argue that that objection is engaging in the marketplace of ideas. That people who, if somebody has a viewpoint and other people disagree with it, they should engage in counter protests, and they should say that we're not going to purchase this person's book or subscribe to their viewpoints. And I don't think that shows a problem necessarily with free speech on campus. I think that's a robust marketplace of ideas. I would also point out, for every case, I wasn't sure the Chicago reference that the person was referring to, but for every case in which there is a conservative viewpoint being allegedly restricted on college campuses, we now have a very recent example of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times author, the New York Times journalist who created the 619 Project, who was refused tenure initially because of her perceived liberal viewpoints. And so I hope that people who are concerned about campus speech freedom are as eager to defend her speech as they are that of other conservative viewpoints.
Rebecca, did you have anything you wanted to add? I know, both of you teach at different universities. Did you have anything you wanted to add from your perspective at the University of Denver?
Sure. I feel that as a teacher, it is my job to create an atmosphere in which students can vigorously and in good faith disagree with one another. And so it's definitely something that I work on intentionally to make sure that students of all viewpoints and of all faiths and of all different backgrounds feel that they can state their piece. I think that's my job as an educator. But to echo something that Ian said, I do not believe in protecting students from the emotional and social fallout of the things that they say. I also don't believe in hiding my own ideological commitments from my students. And so as an educator, one of the things that I say to my students openly, candidly, is here's how I feel about these issues. I own that for you. That's a sign of respect. I am not a con law bot. I do not just spit out the principles, right? I approach these as a human, as a parent, as a member of my own faith, as a woman, right? So I come out on these issues in a certain way, and I'm going to be candid about that for you. I'm also open to your critique about whether I'm facilitating an environment in the classroom where you feel like you can speak up. So let's do this, right? Let's approach this like adults, where we can say our piece, where the moderator or the facilitator of the forum is taking on kind of an extra responsibility to facilitate in a way that is, productive and respectful. But let's also own the consequences of the things that we say that might be hurtful or offensive or even just shocking or provocative.
Great. So our next question comes from Richard Dangler. Ian, he's asking for some examples of things that are not free speech.
Okay, well, so I think I maybe was misspeaking a little bit. Something can be free speech and not protected by the First Amendment. So sometimes I use those terms interchangeably, but let me give an example of what I think he was getting at and what I was meaning to refer to. For example, social media, well, let me do two. One, Colin Kaepernick, private organizations do not have to follow the First Amendment. So remember the First Amendment text says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Congress has been interpreted to mean both the federal government and the states through the incorporation clause, through the 14th Amendment. But so that means that the NFL can restrict Colin Kaepernick's speech all they want. I do not think that is the end of the story. I think that there are free speech values at play and that they should not have engaged in that type of repression of the take a knee protests. But regardless about what the NFL should have done, they were allowed to restrict speech. Now, whether they were colluding to punish him is a different labor law issue, but they were allowed to restrict his speech. However, in the public school context, the same protest, the same take a knee protest by a student athlete, because now we are not engaging with a private company, we are engaging with a public school. Those students and their actions are protected by the First Amendment. So it very much matters the context, and then the other and the players, and then the other example that would probably be too long to get into in detail, but I will say that private social media companies do not have to abide by the First Amendment. So Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these are private companies. They have their own free speech rights as sort of free speech actors, but they, because of that, they can kick people off their platforms, restrict speech, edit speech, add commentary, and President Trump's very recent effort to sue those companies will fail in the courts because they are private companies, and so therefore the First Amendment is not at play.
I could offer another angle on that. Ian and I are both lawyers. We are members of the bar, and so we're subject to an extraordinary set of speech restrictions that nobody thinks violates our free speech rights, because we have a specialized context where we have a set of prerogatives by virtue of our bar license, right? So that's just one example where there's all sorts of things that functionally are speech that are heavily regulated without raising problems under the First Amendment, because it's just treated as a kind of specialized context. And another example we could throw out would be disclosure rules for publicly traded companies under the Securities and Exchange Act, right? It turns out that there's an immense amount of human activity that is speech, but is not protected against government regulation by the First Amendment.
Well, since we're on that topic, we have a couple of questions regarding social media. Wolcott is wondering what your thoughts are around Trump being deplatformed from social media companies. And then Bob Rush is asking a question about this threatened lawsuit, class action lawsuit by Trump. In particular, his contention that these social media companies are essentially extensions of the state.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm happy to let the professor answer that one, but I'll jump in and say, it's an interesting theoretical construct. Taking it out of the lawsuit for a second, it's interesting to say that at some point, social media companies become like public utilities, and therefore that they should be able to be regulated. The Supreme Court has rejected that notion relatively recently. In the last few years, there was a case involving public access television in New York, and people thought that, but that was run through a private company, and people thought that, it's public access, even though it's being run through a private cable distributor. This is how the court is going to go and maybe set up future restrictions on speech, and the court rejected. So whether you like that sort of in theory, and it's interesting in theory, there's no way, again, to be a one-handed lawyer here, there is no way that the Supreme Court will accept that view, even with the new conservative members of the court, and there's sort of no case law to back that up. So Trump's lawsuit will fail. regardless of whether you think it should win or not win, I'm just saying what will happen, and there is no legal basis for that somewhat interesting theoretical argument.
So my next question comes from Lauren, and he asks if you would discuss hate speech. How is it defined in court opinions? What are some of the boundaries around hate speech? And does your book address hate speech?
It does. And I begin, and it's such an important question, it's such an important issue, and a little bit of what Professor Aviel was asking about where do I have problems with our current doctrine. And the most difficult area for me is hate speech. So I begin that chapter in my book where I talk about it with Nazis marching in Charlottesville, and I'm Jewish, and having that, Jews will not replace us, echoing on the campus of UVA and in Charlottesville, excuse me, not UVA, but around Charlottesville. It's incredibly disturbing. And there is an answer to that question. People often say, well, there's free speech, but that doesn't include hate speech. And that is false. The Supreme Court considers hate speech an absolutely protected part of free speech. And the case I describe in elaborate detail is the case involving the very hateful Westboro Baptist Church, who used to protest outside of military funerals. I won't say all the horrible things they say, but on their signs, but essentially they think that military deaths were God's punishment for Americans' over sympathy toward gay rights in this country, in their view. And they protested outside of a particular military funeral, a man named Snyder. The case goes up to the Supreme Court, and Justice Roberts says that paraphrasing, that if the First Amendment means anything, it means that peaceful protests on public land, even when they are so absolutely hateful and absolutely wounding, and he acknowledges the real wound that comes from that type of speech, that they must be protected, that the First Amendment absolutely protects the thought we hate. And so that is, again, the way the law is, and the way the law will continue to be. I don't believe that has to then be, once again, a situation where we go, well, people can say hateful things, we just have to let it go. No, we should engage in counter-protest, as there often was outside of the Westboro Baptist Church protests, and we should, do lots of types of lobbying and other advocacy around preventing hate. But hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. And one of the remarkable things, I will save this twist for people who read the book, but the father who sued the Westboro Church and one of the members of the Westboro Church both sort of went all the way around in their opinions after the court was done. And I think that's a testament to the power of free speech to change people's minds.
So really, this will be about our last question. And the Supreme Court's term just ended. And this was the Supreme Court with what was supposed to be a 6-3 conservative majority. But many people, many observers are looking at the court more as 3-3-3. I would like to ask both of you your thoughts on how this term ended, what surprised you about this, and whether or not you think it's a 6-3 court or a 3-3-3 court. And Professor Aviel, why don't we start with you?
Yes, please.
You can definitely count me among the people who are still digesting the work product of the Supreme Court from this most recent term. I have never been particularly interested in fighting over whether the court is 3-3-3 or 6-3, in part because I think that the justices are often balancing competing interests, and it can be difficult for us to predict how they'll choose between those. So notably, Chief Justice Roberts has established now a really widely embraced view that he is an institutionalist, he cares about the legitimacy of the court. There are going to be times where his interest in preserving the court's legitimacy and its moral authority in public life is going to be in tension with substantive ideological commitments he might have about freedom of religion or voting rights or whatnot. And so we can't always predict, how a justice like Chief Justice Roberts is going to come out on each of those issues. I will say that the opinion that I'm most worried about is Brnovich, and the extent to which the court is willing to turn us back on the Voting Rights Act, and more specifically, to use methods of interpretation that it's not willing to use in other instances, right? Mm-hmm. So to see justices who embrace a textualist methodology interpreting the Voting Rights Act in a way that really can't be faithfully deemed textualist, I think really raises worrisome questions about selective application. And so that's where I am kind of immersing myself in, a take on this court's term, not so much whether it's 6-3 or 3-3-3, or how, individual justices are going to make different alliances, but, what the Brnovich decision means for protecting representative democracy going forward.
That's so well said, and I agree with everything Professor Aviel said, particularly with the deeply troubling voting rights decision, which is not my area, but just expressing an opinion. Just to add one more sentence, I would say that I see the court as 5-3-1. I see that there were 5 conservatives, 3 liberals, and Justice Roberts is now taking the sort of Justice Kennedy-esque swing vote role, where he's still a deeply conservative Chief Justice, but willing, as the professor said, for institutionalist reasons or public perception reasons, or in the case of First Amendment issues, perhaps out of a strong commitment to First Amendment values. That would be my talk show synthesis of where the court is today, 5-3-1.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but Ian, I told you I'd let you have the last word, okay. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I want to again thank Professor Aviel, Claire, and the Vail Symposium for this wonderful and really thoughtful discussion. And I just wanted to say, in addition to thank you, that people can find out more about my book at my website, thefightforfreespeech.com, the same title as my book. And I'm also very excited to let people know that there is going to be a graphic novel adaptation of my book coming out from Macmillan First Second, called Free Speech Handbook. It has amazing illustrations by Mike Cavallaro, and that's coming out on November 2nd. So even though it's an adult graphic novel, for those people who are interested in exposing their middle school and high school kids to some of the concepts in this book, I think it's a really great tool for that. So thank you. And if people want to continue this discussion and they had questions that couldn't be answered, they can go to thefightforfreespeech.com and email me through the website, and I'd be happy to answer any specific questions and engage in some online debate.
Thank you both for this fascinating but also incredibly important conversation. And thanks to our audience for joining us this evening. I hope you'll join us next week. Our first in-person program since 2020, March of 2020, will be at the Vail Interfaith Chapel. We'll have 2 ambassadors, Ambassador Gary Grappo and Ambassador Christopher Hill. Good night, everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you.